Hello, everyone. My name is Kiara, and I am the Millennium Fellowship Campus Director of Florida International University, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. I am so excited to welcome you all today for our 5th Millennium Fellowship webinar with Mr. Juan Chebly. As we wait for more participants to join, please introduce yourself in the chat box by typing your name, university, and country. We will be starting in about 5 minutes. All right, everyone, we will now begin our 5th Millennium Fellowship webinar with Professor Juan Chebly. For the next 45 to 50 minutes, we will first have our 15-minute moderated dialogue with Professor Chebly. For the remaining 30 minutes, we will open it up for a Q&A so you can ask your own questions. A few items to keep in mind: please remember to mute yourself when you are not speaking, and throughout the webinar, type in your introductions and questions in the chat box. For those who have just joined us, welcome! My name is Kiara, the Millennium Fellowship Campus Director of Florida International University, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. Please introduce yourself by writing down your name, university, and country down in the chat box. It's wonderful seeing so many faces here from all around the world. Let's get started. To start off today's topic, I would like to introduce Professor Chebly. Juan Elias Chebly is a sustainable development economist currently serving as a visiting professor of economics at the Tobin College of Business, St. John's University in New York. He has served as lead advisor to the UN Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations Environment Program and as a global coordinator at the UN Development Program. He is the founder of VoidBox and GiveMe5.org. At age 24, he became St. John Tobin College of Business youngest professor in 2010. In 2009, he founded VoidBox.com, a telecom startup introducing innovative and pioneering VoIP telephony solutions in South America and the US. From 2013 to 2019, Juan has been tasked to serve in different capacities as a report writer, researcher, program manager, public speaker, strategic advisor, and community builder at the UN at the juncture between academic research, policymaking, and inclusive governance through partnerships and global outreach. Welcome, Professor Chebly. It's a pleasure having you today. How are you doing?
Hi, Kiara. I'm doing pretty well. Thank you. Thank you so much for this connection. I would also like to thank the Millennium Campus Network and UN Academic Impact for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for those kind remarks. We will now proceed to our moderated dialogue. Millennium Fellows are at the beginning of their social impact careers. What concrete advice do you have for all 1,092 fellows that are working on addressing the 17 SDGs?
Well, I mean, before I go into any specific advice, I would first like to commend you for your commitment. The fact that you are Millennium Fellows speaks highly of the career choices that you've made, even from the start, from the get-go, as you embark in your studies. You know, values as empathy, humility, inclusion, I think that are paramount to building the world that we want. And I think that you've chosen a right path. So I am very happy to share with you. You know, it's not very often that I get to share with such a committed group of students from all over the world. So to me, it's a pleasure, and I commend you for that. In terms of advice, I think, you know, follow your dreams. I think that might sound like a cliche, but sometimes in this world, we are driven by what is expected of us. What is the sort of framework that we're expected to follow to achieve success? If I look back, one thing that I definitely do not regret is following my conscience, following my values, and following my dreams. If you map out my life, you probably see that I've had the most unconventional path into the UN. Basically a career in reverse. On my first week at work, I was briefing the UN Secretary General, and then and the last year of my career, the UN has been looking at a computer screen by myself. So But the one thing, and in my path there from private sector to back to Venezuela and then back into academia has certainly not been very conventional, but I've always been happy, and that has allowed me to flourish, and that has allowed me to contribute in a meaningful way. So that's my number one advice.
All right, thank you, Professor Chebly, for encouraging our fellows to follow their dreams and pursue current ambitions. I think it's a great way for the Millennium Fellows to relate and make those tangible connections, as well as a fantastic way to lead into the following question. There are more young people in the world today than ever before. From your experience, how can we as youth be advocates for the SDGs, especially those working on care or care about climate change?
Well, I would like to quote a friend, Dr. Mohammed Yunus from Bangladesh, once said, he often says actually, that the mind of the youth is a blank slate. It's not polluted. Like we older people, our mind is already conditioned of sorts, or he says contaminated or polluted. And you have that great advantage where you can truly bring a new way of doing things, innovation, a 21st century approach to the 21st century challenges. Unfortunately, when it comes to our established leaders, we are used to looking at the world from a 20th century perspective. So it ends up really hard trying to fix and problems when you cannot think outside of this box. I think the youth has the advantage of not had been polluted with the experience of tools that are failing us. So in this sense, you have a plethora of opportunities to come up with the solutions that will get us to avert and mitigate climate change, for example, to ensure that no one is left behind, social inclusion, and to ensure that we have a peaceful society. So I truly think that engagement and commitment is number one, which you already are doing, but also sharing. It's not enough to, go and do great stuff, great things every day. You also have to share. You have to communicate to the world what it is that you're doing, not for a self-serving reason, but rather to inspire others to do the same.
All right, so next question. I would absolutely love to know how you started your career at the UN. You have said it was unconventional, so if you could please provide insight on how you got started and tell our fellows a little bit about it.
Sure. So yeah, definitely, definitely unconventional. So I always felt a passion for economics. I was a high school student. The first time I ever took economics, I was fortunate enough to travel to California and take economics 101 at UCLA, and while I was in high school. So from Venezuelan high school all the way to UCLA, and that really marked me. Now, I was not that good at economics. I'll have to admit. It was not the topic that came the easiest to me. And when I came back to school in New York City to do a soccer scholarship, I was fortunate enough to have a scholarship. Otherwise, it would have been really hard for myself and my parents to be able to afford tuition here in the United States. I decided to go for business instead. Business seemed to be a easier choice for me at the time to allow me to play soccer and do other things. And then when I finished my undergrad career in management business, I decided to go for a master's in business administration, and finance was my concentration. Finance, again, came to me very naturally. So as you see, I was avoiding economics, but I was also taking a lot of electives because I enjoyed doing it, but I wanted to keep a high GPA. So, and I was focused on Wall Street. That's really what I wanted to do. So when I graduated, finished with a master's degree, I was really not necessarily following my passion. I was mostly focused on Wall Street, trying to make a good salary. So when now this happened in 2008 during the financial crisis, when I saw what Wall Street, the role that Wall Street was playing in the financial crisis of 2008, unfortunately, I was very disappointed. So I had the choice of working for Goldman Sachs or coming back and teaching as an adjunct. That's how I became the youngest professor in the faculty. I decided to come back and teach. I realized at that point that even if I had spent the last 6 years preparing myself to for that world, that I could not possibly be happy with my conscience working for an establishment that was destroying the lives of people and the livelihoods of people just because of greed. So I realized that I wanted to do something more with academia while I figured out where my livelihood would come. So I pursued a PhD, and it was through the PhD internship experience that I ended up at UNDP. Did a good job there. I took it very seriously, and then eventually they hired me. And then the rest is history. I've been there 7 years. So I mean, I was lucky. That was, again, very unconventional. Internships at the UN that don't necessarily lead. They're not built to lead to full employment, full-time employment. But in my case, it was extraordinary set of circumstances. In 2013, we were getting ready to design the SDGs, a lot of youth engagement. But that's not to discourage you. I mean, there are plenty of opportunities, if not working within the system, to work in favor of or in partnership with the UN system. And it's really that exposure that allows you to gain the skills and to build the relationships that will allow you to achieve things in international development.
All right, thank you so much. Last question: from your experience working at the UN, what advice would you offer for rising social impact workers and influencers so they can step their foot in, making the right connections, reaching out to their universities, advisors, stuff like that?
Sorry, I missed the first part.
It's okay. So from your experience working at the United Nations, what advice would you offer for rising social impact workers and or influencers who want to get into the UN by reaching out and looking for opportunities, networking, internships? Follow me.
Right. So, when I had a responsibility to hire candidates, whether it was for internships or contract positions at the UN, I would certainly ask people, why they would want to be a part of the UN system. As you would naturally ask that question to any candidate for any organization. In many cases, we all have had, well, in this case, really not me, but many people have the dream of working and being a part of the United Nations because of what the UN represents, right? A beacon of peace and health and human rights and for all, development for all. For me, it was not the case. I never really dreamed about this. Again, I had to do an internship for my PhD, and it happened that UNDP in New York were a good fit, and that was the only opportunity that I took up on, and it happened. So it was it was a nice coincidence of things. But when you really think about it, it was not about what you desire and what your dreams are. I mean, that's all nice, but an institution like the UN, with all its challenges, with all its organizational structures and whatnot, and with its big mandate, what they really are looking for is talent or skill sets, whether they may be social skills or professional or technical skills. That's usually the case. And so it's not about, and you know, the words of JFK, it's not what the UN can do for you in fulfilling your dreams. What can you do for the United Nations? What are you bringing that is unique? What are you bringing that will benefit your peers, your program, your agency, and so on and so forth. So the UN is not a homogeneous place. You know, if we have 53 UN agencies, funds, and programs, I know I've worked with all of them. I've coordinated the strategic uh, um, program of the UN across agencies, and I know they're very, very different agencies. They have different priorities, different ways of working, different cultures. So, you know, you have to be specific. What it is that you want to do, where, and how can you add value? If you have that very clear, I think you have a chance. It's very competitive, though. Now, I will also say that you can do a lot of good work from NGOs. I mean, you don't necessarily have to be within the system. Actually, the minute you're part of the system, you're very much tied by policies and procedures of the system. And they, you know, people say, oh, it's a big bureaucracy. Sure, it is. It is built and designed that way. So to expect otherwise would be futile.
All right, thank you, Professor Chebly, for answering our questions. Those were some amazing points you made at the conclusion of your answer. I think we learned a lot from that. Thank you so much for sharing them. We will now proceed to the Q&A portion of our webinar. If you have any questions for Professor Chebly, please ask it in the chat box. I encourage fellows that are seeking advice on improving their social impact work to also ask a question in the chat box. When we call your name, we will unmute your microphone, so please introduce yourself and ask your question. Let's see what we have so far. Okay, so I'm going to choose Niru Bogawata to ask their question.
So yeah, my quick question is like, in the next 15 years, what do you reckon the main challenge the UN has to face in terms of impact?
Okay, so should I go ahead? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for your question. Well, in terms of impact, you know, the expectation of the United Nations should definitely be objective in the sense that the UN convenes. It's a place for convening. We have the member states, you know, pretty much all of the countries of the world there being able to meet face to face and discuss issues and challenges and come to consensus. Now, one thing is to agree on what needs to be done. Think about the Paris Agreement. Think about the SDGs or Agenda 2030. Now, another thing is to ensure that those agreements come to a reality. When it comes to implementation, really, the UN has no way of enforcing. You know, even the Paris Agreement, where the General Assembly has made it a somewhat, how do you call it, binding. That's the word escaping me for a minute there. Binding agreement. Because if you think about it, it is a binding agreement, but then again, they're based on voluntary, you know, commitments. Now, so there's nothing the UN as a global institution that, you know, the secretary would be able to go back and tell member states, oh, you failed to achieve. I mean, we could point that out, but we could not necessarily go and enforce these policies or legislation at the national level. So it's really up to the member states to ensure that, you know, we have impact on the ground. All we can do is promote, you know, and communicate the fact that governments around the world have committed to this type of agreements. Now, that doesn't mean that the UN should just simply sit back and wait. No, we can devise mechanisms for accountability that are polling people, for example, asking people's opinion, objective measurement of progress is something that I've worked very hard within the UN, but it's been very hard to gain any traction because, you know, simply some member states do not want it. They don't want to have transparency. They don't want to be, let's say, measured in progress. So that's a big problem, you know, and we saw that with the design of the Sustainable Development Goals. We had many countries fighting some of the goals that pertain or related to governance. So what we can do as people, the peoples of the world, we the peoples, we can certainly participate in and occupy these spaces to ensure that, you know, the leadership of nations cannot get away with this type of behavior, and that they live up to the UN Charter, where it clearly states that inclusion and participation are basically the bedrock of the foundation of the United Nations.
All right, we will now move on to Afra. Please include your name, university, and country when introducing yourself. Okay, well, it doesn't seem that they are with us. Afra's question was, how do we convince people that we're not being crazy when we make the decisions we make? The world is all about who makes the most money, and that's not our concern as impact makers. We're mostly about pain alleviation most people don't get to understand.
Wow, that's a great question, Afra.
Yeah.
You know, I've said this many a times. I remember being at the ECOSOC chamber in front of 500 people. You know, I was due to talk about the UN Environment Program projects, but I couldn't help myself to point out a statistic that, you know, it's really, you know, it's appalling to me. When the SDGs were passed, people were criticizing the SDGs as too many, too ambitious, too expensive to achieve. I thought this was ridiculous. I thought that if 194 member states committed to doing something by 15 years, if the world made its mind to doing something, then why would it be impossible? If one nation decided and committed itself to going to the moon and achieved it, how come the entirety of humanity is committing to, you know, alleviate, you know, basically achieving the 17 goals and not being able to make it? So I looked at the financing. So what moves the world, to me, it was clear that it was financial interest of corporations. So how much money would we need to achieve the SDGs? Columbia University estimated that we would need we would have a financing gap of about 200 billion per year. Now, people don't think in terms of billions or trillions. So I looked at, okay, well, if it is money that moves the world, then how much of it we will need? Sort of playing, you sometimes need to play the system, right? And I discovered that out of those 200 billion, we were talking about only 90 billion coming from governments. So that's a public spending gap. Well, how much is that for a regular person? Well, I looked at military spending estimated by the Stockholm Peace Institute to be about $1.7 trillion. So if you compare those two, you have a ratio of 17 to 1. 17 seems to be a recurring number. But in other words, we have the fact that with only 5%, again, 5% of global military spending, we could definitely bridge that public spending gap, assuming, of course, that we realign our infrastructure and financial systems to sustainable development, which is not a minor task. However, the spending gap is minor. It's not, you know, what we're told by the World Bank when they say, oh, we're going to need $7 trillion. They're talking about the entirety of infrastructure investment, not the gap. So, I mean, first of all, it's bad marketing. You don't tell society, well, we need, you know, a sixth of the gross world product to achieve the SDGs. That makes no sense. People will be discouraged. Now, if you tell them this is the differential, then and all we have to do is change the way we do things for the better, then people get more optimistic. And, you know, when you think about 5% of global military spending, is that really ambitious? I mean, can we say that there are too many goals? I mean, if all we're trying to ensure is human rights, I mean, you know, it's like saying that there are too many human rights. I don't know that anybody would complain about that. So, so certainly there's a lot that we can do with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we have to prioritize them and we have to put our money where our mouth is. So we have to realign the interest of business and our economies so that it is not about profit, but also achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, namely social inclusion and environmental sustainability. So, you know, in short, my proposals to the World Bank and the IMF, as I was working with them during the G20 in 2018, was why don't we go to the root of the problem? How do we define the activities of business? By law, fiduciary duty says and demands of agents that run corporations that they maximize profits. That's microeconomics 101. That's how firms operate. It's not because they're evil, not because they're against the UN or against the environment. That's really what they're mandated by law to do. So why don't we redefine that law, that fiduciary law that says we have to maximize profit, to say we have to maximize value. Any finance person will tell you it is not about profits, it's about value. Value has a lot to do with the long-term health of a company, has a lot to do with not only stockholders, but also stakeholders. So if we redefine these fundamental notions that drive the world, we're sort of gaming the system, changing the system for good. It's not about destroying everything that is there, but really to harnessing the power of the markets to build a circular economy, to build a green economy. But I think it is possible. We just have to have the political will and the right legislation to do it.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We are now going to move on to Ogwan's question. Ogwan, if you can please introduce yourself by saying your name, university, and country. Ogwan? Okay, so Ogwan's question was, we have high prevalence of undernutrition in the northeastern part of the country, Uganda. I would love for you to clarify on some of the opportunities for the young people to help mitigate these problems.
All right, Ogwan. You know, I'll have to admit I'm not an expert in food systems. Now, what I can tell you is that if we're to ensure equality of opportunities across countries, one thing is clear. The developed world will have to be more engaged and live up to their commitments with regards to supporting development in least developed countries. Now, I don't know if Uganda meets this qualification, but in any case, what it means is that the developed world has promised to the rest of the world that they would pledge 0.7% of their GDP, sorry, not GDP, GNI, gross national income, to helping countries invest in infrastructure that would ensure food and health around the world. So this, unfortunately, is not the case. Out of the OECD countries, you know, about 20 or 30 of them, only a handful of them, maybe Sweden, the UK at times, and some others, do fulfill this commitment. Even the United States, which is the gross biggest donor to the UN and to ODA, official development assistance, that you know, it's only 0.3 of gross national income. So we have to know these figures to know who's meeting their international obligations, who's not, and what can we do about it? Because the fact of the matter is that some of these countries do not have the necessary funds to invest in infrastructure that will allow for food production to increase or for health services to be more available. In the case of food, though, there is hope that with the advent of new technologies like drop-by-drop irrigation systems or even hydroponics and vertical farms, we can actually ensure food for all. I think a plant-based diet, for example, is also something that is proven to provide benefits at a more efficiency. So if you're a young person in Uganda, I would definitely try hydroponics. Urban farming reduces transportation cost, and it's weatherproof. And to me, it's really the future of farming. Now, I might be wrong, so it's just a thought.
Okay, Atta? Atta?
Yes, madam.
Oh, please introduce yourself by saying your question, name, university, and country, and ask your question.
Yes, I am Ataullah Khan from University of Sargodha, Pakistan. My question is that how can we educate the people who are uneducated in different parts of the world? Because education is the key to all the basic problems. Then please, sir, give me the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Atta. Yes, education is to me the key to unlocking sustainable development. But not any type, not just any type of education. It has to be values-based education, in my opinion, so that we're not only acquiring the technical skills, we're also acquiring a sense of global community, if you will, that understands that we are not simply isolated nations and groups of peoples, depending on our race or religion, but rather we're one big global human family, and that our planet knows no boundaries, and our planet makes no distinction when it comes to race and religion. We're all part of the same biosphere. So education has to be centered around these truths. I mean, the fallacies that we're sold with regards to nationalism, for example. When you think about it, national borders are nothing but, imaginary lines that we've built. So if we want to live by these principles, then we're overriding the natural truth, which is in front of us, which is our planet. And that is very dangerous, but because we end up with persistent conflict and with total destruction and decimation of the environment. So education based on principles, I think, is key. How do we ensure everybody has access to it? Well, very simple. We follow through on the fact that education is a human right, not a privilege. And we ensure through maybe progressive taxation or shifting military and other wasteful spending towards education. There's no way any country should have, no reason any country should have a higher percentage of military expenditures than education. At least 4% is a recommended minimum investment of GDP on education. If your country does not meet this requirement, then your country is underinvesting in its own people, in its human capital, and in its own future. There's no way a country can achieve development if they're not investing in education. If we are to say that the world moves to the beat of quarterly financial statements of corporations, then let's ensure that we're taxing these corporations and we're putting this money to work for all people and not for a global elite.
Okay, now we will receive some questions from Zuleika.
Hello.
Hi, please introduce yourself by saying your name, where you're from, university, country, and
Okay. Hi, so my name is Zuleika and I'm from King's College, London. So my first question is, first of all, just now you mentioned about harnessing the power of markets to achieve the SDG. So how do we do this as consumers, facilitate it, especially given that the market is imperfect? And my second question is, what are some of the considerations in designing a measurement system for the effectiveness of our projects? Thank you.
All right. Well, great questions. Very insightful questions. Number one, the market, as you well put it, is not always perfect, right? As a matter of fact, it's more imperfect than perfect. What does that mean? We have to make the markets work for us and not the other way around. There's no one size fits all solution, but there are solutions that can be applied in many countries. For example, when you think about fossil fuels, for sure we're not paying for the entirety of the cost of that fossil fuel. When you think about carbon as a pollution that is damaging the common well-being, to not pay up front for the cost of cleaning our atmosphere, which by the way can be done, is to really underpay for fossil fuels. So if we're underpaying, that leads to overconsumption, and that's exactly the case here. So for example, a carbon tax will be a mechanism where this market imperfection would be corrected. And that tax could be then utilized to ensure that we are either growing more trees, or we are devising technologies that will allow us to pull carbon from the atmosphere and create alternative fuels. We have the technologies. What we're lacking is the commitment and the resources to do so. So first, the commitment to change our legislation, correct market imperfections, where market imperfections are perpetuated by lobbying and special interests, to then ensure that we have the necessary resources to fix what has been done, to mitigate those impacts that cannot be averted. So that's on the first question. Sorry, and can you repeat the second part, which was also very interesting?
Okay, so the second question is, what are some of the considerations in designing a measurement system for the effectiveness of our projects?
Oh, right. So impact assessment. Well, you know, I am a big proponent of the theory of collective wisdom. So the theory of collective wisdom, it's a thought process that through your program design, you include all stakeholders, or at least, you know, a diverse group of your stakeholders. So you involve people in your design phase. Doing this will allow you to ensure that all participants have some degree of ownership on your project. If all participants have a higher degree of ownership, they will be more willing and more interested in assessing progress. And this is going to be key, because it is really hard to get people to participate in surveys at times. So, you know, this will ensure a higher rate of surveying. And surveys are a good mechanism, for example, to, you know, perception-based data, especially when official data is unavailable. So if you ask someone, has your life been changed or impacted for good? I mean, they will, who better than them to tell you, right? As opposed to relying on government survey data or household data, you know, income and, you know, and things like that, there's expenditures. So certainly perception-based data can be a useful tool, and it is through the inclusion of stakeholders at the design phase that you will be ensured to have ownership, higher degrees of participation, and also more objective measurements of progress. This is what we've advocated to bring to the UN at a global level, to ensure that we have proper review of SDG progress, and not simply a marketing pitch by governments to say how great they are and how they should stay in power forever. Unfortunately, you know, a high degree of governments, high percentage of governments, you know, have authoritarian rule within the UN. I mean, that's certainly despicable. That's something that we should denounce and not be afraid to use the spaces within the UN to denounce, the rule of a few over the dreams and aspirations of many. So, and what better way to bring impact assessment and perception-based data to places like the UN?
Ooh, okay then. All right. Well, that was not planned. Okay. Next question. Well, next person who will be able to ask their question will be Jackson. Jackson?
Hi.
Oh.
I'm Jackson Shufflebein. I'm from Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona in the US. And my question is, what is your perspective on referring to nations according to a certain dichotomy of like undeveloped versus developed, or global north versus global south, or first world or second world? Is there one that you choose to use, or one that's commonly chosen to use in the UN?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So your question has to do with what categories of countries we use and why? Am I right?
Yeah, and yeah, definitely why you choose that categorization.
Yeah, so the World Bank is the main reference when it comes to least developed countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries, and it's usually based on nominal income. So an income has been traditionally the best proxy for development. Now, that certainly has been changing. We've understood that income is not enough. It's just part of the picture. And especially when we talk about averages. Renowned economist Jeff Sachs always talks about the story of the guy who is frozen. He's literally frozen from the waist down, and literally on fire from the waist up. And if you ask him how's the weather, on average, he'll tell you everything is just fine. So and I think certainly averages are not can disguise poverty, systemic poverty, and whatnot. So think about poverty as not simply a lack of income, but a complex reality that people face. It's a human problem. It's not a numbers problem. So, and we have the multidimensional poverty index at UNDP, the Human Development Index, giving us a clearer view of how countries are performing. So I rely more on these than on the World Bank. However, the World Bank are the most accepted ones, the most universal ones. But there's others. You have the Genuine Progress Index, for example, that the Irish developed. I myself proposed the People's Indicators for Sustainable Development in a paper back in 2014. And the outcome of that has been the My World 2030 survey by the United Nations, where we're assessing progress by asking people what their perception of progress has been. It's not enough. We need more of those, because you're right. I mean, when you think about these measurements are a bit arbitrary, and they're not completely telling us the whole picture.
Thank you.
Okay, and our final question will be coming from Montserrat Valdez. Montserrat?
Sorry, this technology. Hi, everyone. I wanted to ask, first of all, thank you so much, Juan, for everything you've said. Thank you. I'm gonna get to the question. I don't want to diverge. Yeah, so I just want to know what technical skills are you looking for? Like, Like, what should I make sure I learn to like tackle this?
All right. Thank you, Montserrat, for your question. You know, if it was up to me, you know, I will simply take the day off and spend the whole day with you guys, having these great questions come by and having conversation around them. But seeing that we have limited time, I'll say this about skills. I think, like I said before, education, quality education has more to do with values than it has to do with technical skills. For sure, we will need the technical skills. It's like technology. Is technology inherently bad or good? It really depends on how we put to use it and what sort of values are driving technology. So I truly think that skills that pertain to human connection, to building empathy, to humility, to understand what that, you know, what we're good at, what we're not. So humility is not, you know, wearing rags. That's not the real concept of humility. Humility is knowing thyself, and that is good and bad. So if you're clear and you're humble on what you can bring to the table, and what are the things, good or bad, you be able to maximize the good, minimize the bad. In terms of, and that will have a deep influence on the technical skills that you will be bringing as well. I've had phenomenal students from Ivy Leagues, you know, join my team, and they had amazing technical skills. However, they were not team players, for example, or they were there to advance their own interests. That certainly didn't work well with me, because I was more concerned with the UN mandate that we were given. And unfortunately, when you put your self-interest first, the mission and the mandate sometimes is conflicting. So, you know, certainly values come first to me. But if I wanted to highlight technical skills beyond the soft skills that I just mentioned, I would point to data analytics. You know, data analytics can be really useful. An understanding of, you know, if we say, well, you know, profit and greed drives the world, a better understanding of, you know, what is the root of that? Is it that people are inherently bad? No, it means that, you know, the markets are driving our economies, and we have made that choice. So then, if we've made that choice, why did we make that choice? And in the measure that we understand that, we'll be able to fix what's wrong and to keep the things that work. When you look at our options, right, as a global society for distribution and production of goods and services, we have two options. You know, there's no third option that we've discovered so far. It's either central planning, the government telling us what to do, what to produce, where to bring it, and how much of it to consume, central planning, which we've seen doesn't work. Or, you know, free people following their passions and dreams and exchanging goods and services and ideas, the market, the invisible hand. Adam Smith got it right. We've learned over time and time again that it is the second, the latter, that allows us not only to have higher efficiency, productive and allocative efficiency of our scarce resources, but also the mechanism and the framework that allows people to be free and to pursue their dreams and aspirations. So that's what we've got. Now, how do we ensure that that framework, that organization is working for all of us? Well, we have to be able to understand it, right? Microeconomics, what drives it, maximization of profits, that's it. You know, we have to understand what it is. You know, and the more you understand the argument of your adversaries, if you will, or those you want, your potential audience you were trying to convince, the more you understand their arguments, the better you're able to bring them to your fold, to convince them about your ideas. If you have no clue about how Wall Street works, then it will be very hard to bridge through them and even to regulate them effectively. So you sort of have to become a bit of an insider to change things from within, and that has to do sometimes learning the things that we denounce, listening to those who we don't agree with. You know, oftentimes what I find is that people are stuck within their own silos. We build echo chambers for ourselves so we can listen to the ideas and arguments that we agree with. If we do that, then we're simply depriving ourselves of further knowledge and further understanding of why we're headed in the direction that we're headed, and therefore how to change course. So I hope that I've answered your question. I tend to diverge a little bit, but these are not simple questions. And certainly not simple issues we're discussing here today. It's been very, very amenable, and I'm, you know, very happy to have had the opportunity to answer some of your questions. And you know, I'm here. I'm a professor, so I'm always open to students. And we've also created a nonprofit ourselves, the Give Me 5 campaign, to allow for young people like yourselves to engage in this kind of work. Face the UN directly, and acquire some of the skills that you're inquiring about to help organizations like the UN to achieve, you know, sustainable development goals, climate Paris Agreement, and many other wonderful agendas that we have. These are just two, but we have, for example, the biodiversity agenda, certainly one that doesn't get too much light and or media, but certainly one that we have far exceeded planetary boundaries. Biodiversity, certainly a much more complex issue than, say, the ozone layer, for example, or even climate change, because it's not clear who the culprit is beyond ourselves, you know, and deforestation perhaps. And the implications of it are not entirely clear either. But what we can know is that biodiversity is key to environmental systems and environmental services, therefore vital to our existence. So one of the worst effects that climate change is having and will have is biodiversity loss. So I wanted to leave you with that thought, because we usually only think about, you know, polar bears or certain species under threat, but it's a lot more than that. Plants, microorganisms are the very basic foundation to our medicine. So if we deplete them, if we destroy them with monocultures and pesticides and everything bad that happens in the world today, then we're risking our own health and our own long-term survival.
All right, thank you, everyone. That's a wrap for all the questions. Thank you so much, Professor Chebly, for taking the time to share your experiences with us. I know some of the fellows would love to keep in touch with you. What would be the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, so, well, through the Give Me 5 campaign, certainly, we have all of our social media channels. I am also on every single social media. You know, I'm not too far in age from you. So that's a good way. And, you know, I guess, if, you know, I also would be happy to share my email via this way, I guess, if I'll just write it here. So, you know, love to hear your thoughts. I see a lot of people posting on humility and whatnot, and that's great. Yeah, so I'll be happy to share more with you. And one other thing that I can say is that we hopefully will be hosting a conference next year on all of these topics, and mainly focusing on student-led research. So I'll be sure to include Millennium Campus Network, and hopefully some of you fellows will be able to join us here in New York City for that Sustainable Development Conference. So I'll be happy to share directly with the organization more information. If you wanted to email me directly, you can do so through that. I do have 150 students this semester, so if I take a little bit to reply, please bear with me. And I see here, humility is definitely not weakness. Humility is courage. I would say that humility is not weakness. Humility is the courage to love yourself for what you are, to understand what are your limitations. We're all human. Nobody's perfect. To pretend to be would be then weakness, because you would be pretending to be something you're not. And guess what? You cannot hide the sun with one finger. That on one comment that I saw on humility, but hey, I hope to keep the conversation alive. And for any other questions, definitely reach out to me. Social media sometimes faster than email, but I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you again for the amazing talk. I'd also like to thank all the Millennium Fellows who joined our webinar today. I hope you were able to gain some great insights, and we look forward to seeing you all again on our next webinar with a panel of MCN alumni next Thursday, October 31st, 2019, from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. You can register on Crew or on the Millennium Fellow website at millenniumfellows.org/forward-fellows. Have a great day.
Thank you, Kiara. Thank you all. Have a great day.